He was a Jewish teenager fleeing Nazi-occupied Budapest with nothing but a fake identity card and the clothes on his back. 40 years later, that same boy would wake up one morning, make a single phone call, and walk away with $1 billion in profit before lunch, collapsing an entire nation's currency in the process. His name at birth was George Soros. He was born on August 12, 1930, in Budapest, Hungary, the second son of Tivadar and Erzsébet Soros. His father was a lawyer, educated and cultured, a man who loved literature and languages. His mother came from a prosperous silk merchant family. By the standards of Jewish life in Budapest during the 1930s, the Soros family was comfortable, not extravagantly wealthy, but stable, educated, safe, or so they believed. That illusion shattered in March 1944 when Nazi Germany invaded Hungary. George was 13 years old. Overnight, the world he had known, the apartment, the school, the neighborhood, the quiet rhythm of middle-class life, became a death trap. The Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators began rounding up Jewish families with terrifying efficiency. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were loaded onto cattle cars and sent to Auschwitz within weeks. The speed of it was unlike anything Europe had seen. In a matter of months, nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews would be murdered. Tivadar Soros understood what was coming before most people allowed themselves to believe it. He had already survived the Russian Revolution and a stint in a Siberian prisoner of war camp during World War I. He was not a man who flinched from hard truths. He knew that survival would require radical action, not hope. He immediately began purchasing false identity documents for his entire family. He split them up, scattered them across the city under different names, hiding them with non-Jewish families and acquaintances who were willing to take the risk. For George, he arranged a particularly bold cover. A Hungarian government official named Baumbach agreed to claim young George as his Christian godson. George moved into Baumbach's home and lived as a Gentile boy named Sandor Kiss. He watched as Baumbach, whose job required him to deliver deportation notices to Jewish families and catalog their seized property, carried out his duties. George went with him on some of these visits. He was 14 years old, walking through the homes of people being sent to their deaths, pretending to be someone he was not, understanding with every step that discovery meant death. He did not crumble. He watched, he learned, he survived. When Soviet forces finally liberated Budapest in early 1945, the city was in ruins. The war had destroyed the Soros family's financial stability, along with nearly everything else. Hungary had been gutted. The economy was collapsing into one of the worst hyperinflations in recorded history. George was 15 years old, alive in a city that barely functioned, in a country that was now falling under Soviet communist control. He understood immediately that Hungary had no future for him. He needed to get out. In 1947, at 17 years old, George made his way to London. He arrived nearly penniless, knowing almost no one. He speaking English that was functional, but far from fluent. He took whatever work he could find, waiter, railway porter, farmhand picking apples. He applied to the London School of Economics and was accepted. He studied under the philosopher Karl Popper, whose ideas about open societies and the nature of knowledge would permanently shape the way George thought about everything, including, eventually, financial markets. He graduated in 1952 with a degree in philosophy. And then, with no connections and no money, he tried to find his place in the world. He wrote letters to every merchant bank in London asking for a position. Most ignored him. He eventually landed a junior role at Singer and Friedlander, an arbitrage trading firm. He was not a natural fit for the rigid culture of British banking. He was Hungarian, Jewish, unconventional in his thinking, and deeply impatient with rules that existed for the sake of tradition rather than logic. He learned the mechanics of international arbitrage, buying securities in one market and selling them in another to exploit price differences. But he spent most of the 1950s feeling like an outsider, looking in at a world that had not yet decided to let him through the door. In 1956, he moved to New York. He took a position at FM Mayer, a brokerage firm, and then moved to Wertheim and Company, and later to Arnold and Bleichroeder. He was becoming increasingly sophisticated in his understanding of European securities markets, developing an expertise that few Americans possessed at the time. He began to attract attention. He was sharp, unconventional, and willing to make bold calls that more conservative analysts refused to consider. By 1969, he had established his first investment fund. By 1973, he co-founded what would eventually become the Quantum Fund with his partner Jim Rogers. The fund's performance over the following decade was almost incomprehensible. Year after year, it delivered returns that left the rest of Wall Street staring in disbelief. Between 1970 and 1980, the Quantum Fund returned over 3,000%. 3,000%. While the average investor was struggling to beat inflation, George Soros was compounding wealth at a rate that defied conventional financial logic. But even all of that was merely prologue. The moment that would define him, the moment that turned his name into a word that finance ministers still whisper, with a combination of fury and reluctant admiration, came in the summer and autumn of 1992. Here is what you need to understand about what happened, because this is where the story of a Hungarian refugee boy becomes one of the most extraordinary financial lessons in modern history. The United Kingdom had joined the European exchange rate mechanism in October 1990. The exchange rate mechanism was a system designed to reduce currency fluctuations between European nations by pegging their currencies to each other within specific bands. The British pound was pegged at a rate of 2.78 Deutsche Marks, with allowable fluctuation of plus or minus 6%. The problem was that this rate was too high for the actual state of the British economy. Britain was in a recession. Unemployment was rising. Interest rates needed to come down to stimulate growth. But under the rules of the exchange rate mechanism, the British government was forced to keep interest rates high enough to maintain the pound's value within its required band. It was like being forced to sprint while wearing a concrete vest. George Soros understood this with absolute clarity. He had spent decades studying the relationship between government policy, market psychology, and currency values. He had developed a theory he called reflexivity, the idea that market prices do not simply reflect reality, they actively shape it. Investors' beliefs about a currency influence the currency's value, which in turn influences investors' beliefs, creating feedback loops that can push markets far from equilibrium. He believed that the British government's position was fundamentally untenable. The pound was overvalued. The government was burning through foreign currency reserves trying to defend an exchange rate the market did not believe in. And once the market sensed that weakness, a collapse was not just possible, it was inevitable. Through the summer of 1992, Soros and his team at the Quantum Fund quietly began building a short position against the British pound. Shorting a currency means borrowing it, selling it, and betting that its value will fall so that you can buy it back later at a lower price and pocket the difference. Soros was not alone in seeing the opportunity. Other hedge funds and currency traders were positioning similarly, but no one was doing it on the scale that Soros was building toward. By September 1992, the Quantum Fund had accumulated a short position of approximately $10 billion against the British pound. $10 billion. It was one of the largest single currency bets in financial history. On September 16, 1992, a day that would become known forever as Black Wednesday, the British government tried desperately to defend the pound. They raised interest rates from 10% to 12% in the morning and announced a further raise to 15% in the afternoon. They spent billions of pounds of foreign currency reserves buying their own currency on open markets, trying to prop up its value through sheer purchasing power. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The market had made its verdict. The math did not work. The reserves were finite, and the selling pressure was overwhelming. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, the British government announced that the United Kingdom was suspending its membership in the European exchange rate mechanism. The pound was allowed to float freely. It immediately collapsed in value. George Soros made approximately $1 billion in profit in a single day. The man who had crossed Budapest on foot with a fake identity card, who had picked apples for wages in the English countryside, who had been rejected by bank after bank when he arrived in London as a teenager, had just broken the Bank of England. The lesson buried inside this story is not simply about one extraordinary trade. It is about the mental framework that made it possible. Soros did not win because he had better information than everyone else. The British pound's problems were visible to anyone who studied the data carefully enough. He won because he thought differently about how markets work. Most investors ask what something is worth right now. Soros asked how people's beliefs about value create the conditions for massive, sudden shifts. Most investors fear being wrong. Soros understood that the willingness to take a position of enormous size and hold it with conviction while the market moves against you temporarily is itself the rarest and most valuable skill in finance. He had spent his entire life learning to act under conditions of radical uncertainty. A boy who had survived Nazi occupation by trusting his judgment in situations where being wrong meant death had developed a tolerance for risk that no classroom could teach. He called his approach understanding the prevailing bias, identifying the dominant belief that the market has accepted as truth, finding the flaw in that belief, and positioning yourself for the moment the flaw becomes impossible to ignore. The pound trade was the perfect expression of that philosophy. The prevailing bias was that the British government would do whatever it took to stay in the exchange rate mechanism. The flaw was that the economic reality made that position unsustainable. Soros saw the flaw, sized his position accordingly, and waited. Georgi Schwartz left Budapest with nothing but a borrowed name and a will to survive. that most people will never be tested enough to discover in themselves. He arrived in London as a teenager with empty pockets and a mind that had been sharpened by circumstances no human being should have to endure. He did not become one of the most consequential investors in history because he was lucky. He became what he became because every single year of hardship taught him something that comfort never could. That reality does not care about your feelings about it, and that the person who sees clearly when everyone else is looking away will always find the edge. If this story moved you, if somewhere in the journey of a Jewish boy from Budapest, you recognized something about the gap between where you are and where you are capable of going, then you already understand the most important thing this channel is built to do. We are not here to give you stock tips. We are here to show you how the greatest financial minds in history actually thought, because that thinking is available to anyone willing to study it. Subscribe now, and every week we will bring you another story like this one.